Imagine waking up one day with the eerie sensation that the world around you has somehow shifted. Not in the obvious way of buildings crumbling or skies darkening, but in a subtle, disquieting sense that what you once thought was solid beneath your feet is now made of smoke and mirrors. You walk through the same streets, see the same people, and hear the same voices. Yet everything feels strangely hollow, like an echo of what it used to mean. And you begin to wonder, what if the greatest crisis of our age is not war or famine or even the destruction of the planet, but a silent unraveling of meaning itself, a collapse so deep and invisible that we hardly dare to name it. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls," and in those words lies a mirror to our own predicament. Because we live in an age of unparalleled comfort and technological marvels, yet inside many feel a gnawing emptiness, a restless anxiety, a loneliness that no amount of likes, followers, or fleeting pleasures can truly satisfy. Imagine scrolling endlessly through the endless labyrinth of digital images, faces smiling, adventures unfolding, lives seemingly vibrant, and yet, after hours of this hypnotic drift, you set your phone down only to feel more alienated than before, more estranged from yourself, as if the images of others have swallowed the possibility of your own authenticity. And in that moment, a terrifying question arises. What if the thing we call progress has not made us freer, but more enslaved? Not more whole, but more fragmented. Not more conscious, but more blind. We are told we have choice, freedom, individuality, and yet we live with the constant suspicion that the choices we make are no longer our own, that they are whispered into us by algorithms, advertisers, traditions, and unconscious fears that stretch back centuries, so that what we call our life may be little more than a shadow play cast on the walls of a prison we cannot even see. Is this not the paradox of our age, that in an era where knowledge is limitless, we are more lost than ever, drifting further from the depths of our own psyche, cut off from the very roots of being that once gave human existence its mysterious, terrifying, and ecstatic weight? You may ask yourself, why, if we are surrounded by so much abundance, do we feel starved for meaning? Why, if we can communicate across oceans in an instant, do we still struggle to speak the raw truth even to those closest to us? Why, if we have conquered diseases, built machines that think, and mapped the universe itself, do we remain unable to face the vast unmapped continent of our own unconscious? And what if, lurking in the depths of that unconscious, there is something we are avoiding, something ancient, primal, and terrifying, something that Jung hinted at when he spoke of the shadow, that part of ourselves we deny and repress, yet which grows in power the more we refuse to confront it? Could it be that the crisis of our time is not political, not economic, not technological, but psychological and spiritual? A forgetting of the self so profound that we mistake our masks for our faces, our distractions for our desires, and our survival for our destiny. Imagine, then, a future in which humanity continues this drift into surface-level identities, where entire generations forget the language of the soul, where ritual, myth, and deep encounter are replaced by fleeting dopamine hits, and where the human being, stripped of all inner orientation, wanders like a sleepwalker through the ruins of a civilization that looks vibrant from the outside but is hollow within. Would you recognize yourself in such a world, or would you, too, be lulled by the spectacle? What if the very thing you call you is already half asleep, dreaming someone else's dream, and the life you think you are living is in fact only a half-lived imitation of what could have been? This is the terrible question that lurks beneath Jung's warning, that humanity, for all its advancements, may be more lost than ever because it has lost a thread of the soul, the thread that once bound individuals to something larger, more mysterious and more enduring than themselves. And yet, to admit this is only the beginning. For to confront the possibility that we are lost is to open the door to asking why. And that question leads into depths we have been trained, conditioned, and terrified to avoid, depths where psychology bleeds into philosophy, where the unconscious reveals its archetypal machinery, and where the roots of our disorientation must finally be exposed if we are ever to find our way again. If you look closely at the quiet tremors beneath our daily lives, you begin to notice that the true weight of our disorientation is not in the external world of collapsing institutions or technological chaos, but in the inner world where the psyche itself is fraying. For Jung understood that the modern human is not simply confused, but fundamentally severed from the deep roots of their own being, torn away from what he called the archetypal foundation of the collective unconscious, those ancient patterns of myth and meaning that once wove the fabric of human existence into a coherent tapestry. Consider how, for millennia, stories, rituals, and symbols gave shape to the human soul, acting as bridges between the finite self and the infinite mystery of existence. Yet, in our modern age, these symbols have been hollowed out, their meanings trivialized, commercialized, or dismissed as irrelevant superstition, and so the psyche wanders, without maps, drifting in a world stripped of transcendent orientation. This is why Jung warned that when we cast out myth, we do not become rational, we become disoriented, because the soul requires meaning just as the body requires air. And in the absence of nourishing myths, counterfeit myths rise in their place, consumerist fantasies, political cults, even the glowing idols of our screens, all functioning as substitutes for genuine connection to the unconscious depths, yet lacking the power to truly satisfy, leaving us in a constant state of restless hunger. Think of how often people today describe themselves as burned out, disconnected, anxious, or lost, terms that have been normalized to the point of banality. But underneath them lies a profound psychological truth. The modern individual is adrift because they have been taught to ignore the inner world in favor of the outer, to prioritize productivity, status, and external validation over the delicate dialogue with the unconscious that alone can give rise to authentic wholeness. Jung argued that modern man is in danger of losing his soul precisely because he no longer believes he has one. And in this skepticism we see the roots of our crisis. For without belief in the reality of the inner life, without reverence for its symbols and terrors, we reduce ourselves to machines of consumption and production, and machines do not know how to live, only how to function. Psychology itself, when stripped of Jung's depth, has become a tool for adjustment rather than transformation, teaching people how to cope with alienation rather than confront its source, how to numb their anxiety rather than hear the voice beneath it, how to fit in rather than awaken. But what lies beneath this refusal to engage the soul is fear, the fear of the shadow. The parts of ourselves we repress because they do not align with our curated self. The anger, envy, lust, cruelty, vulnerability, and grief that we exile into the unconscious, yet which grow darker and more powerful the longer they are denied, shaping our behavior in ways we cannot see. Jung warned that what you resist persists, and nowhere is this truer than with the shadow. For individuals who deny their darkness projected outward, blaming others, demonizing enemies, and participating in collective scapegoating rather than acknowledging the enemy within, Entire societies, Jung observed, can fall prey to this projection. And when that happens, the results are catastrophicals, genocides, ideological purges, all born from humanity's refusal to integrate the darkness it carries within itself. If you look at the world today, with its polarizations, its dehumanizing rhetoric, its inability to engage in genuine dialogue, you can see the shadow at work on a global scale, each side convinced of its own purity, blind to the reflection of its hatred in the face of the other. But this blindness is not just political, it is existential. For by refusing to integrate the shadow, we deny ourselves the possibility of true individuality, remaining half-formed, split beings, unable to reconcile the light and dark within us. And yet the problem goes deeper still, because beneath the shadow lies another forgotten truth, that the unconscious is not merely a storehouse of repressed desires, but a vast reservoir of archetypal energies, a living matrix of mythic patterns that shape our lives whether we know it or not. Jung called this the collective unconscious, a realm in which symbols such as the hero, the mother, the trickster, and the wise old man live on as timeless forces surfacing in our dreams, our fantasies, our arts, and our religions. But in a society that no longer knows how to read symbols, these archetypes continue to operate unconsciously, pulling the strings of our behavior while we mistake them for personal quirks or external pressures. Consider how the archetype of the hero manifests today, not as a mythic journey toward transformation, but as a culture of hyper-individualistic achievement, where everyone is pressured to be their own hero, to optimize themselves endlessly, to conquer obstacles without pause. Yet this distorted heroism leaves people exhausted, anxious, and perpetually unsatisfied because it lacks the balancing wisdom of other archetypes, especially the one Jung prized most, the self, the archetype of wholeness, which integrates opposites and points toward individuation, the process of becoming fully oneself. Without awareness of the self, individuals chase fragments of identity, career success, beauty, wealth, social approval, mistaking them for the whole, and thus remain trapped in a cycle of striving and despair. So, the hidden problem is not merely that we are distracted or superficial, but that we are cut off from the living depths of our psyche, estranged from the archetypal patterns that once gave life coherence, condemned to wander in a world of surfaces where the inner compass spins wildly without direction. And if you pause to feel the weight of this, you may recognize it in your own life, in the moments when no achievement, no relationship, no possession seems to satisfy, in the quiet suspicion that you are playing a role without knowing the script, in the unsettling dreams that trouble your sleep, in the anxiety that no amount of rational explanation can soothe. This is the price of losing touch with the unconscious. And Jung believed it is the deepest danger of modernity, not that we have too much knowledge, but that we have forgotten the knowledge within, the wisdom written in the symbolic language of the psyche, the myths that once taught us how to live, how to suffer, how to die, and how to be reborn. And so, while the world dazzles us with its endless novelties, beneath the surface humanity grows more lost, because we have abandoned the very roots that could guide us back to wholeness. And this abandonment, this repression, this exile of the soul, is the silent wound at the center of our age. A wound we have barely begun to acknowledge, much less heal, and until we do, everything else, our politics, our technologies, our relationships will remain haunted by this absence, this forgotten depth that cries out for recognition, The consequences of this exile from the unconscious are not abstract or distant, but immediate, woven into the very texture of our daily lives. And the most unsettling truth is that they operate invisibly, shaping choices, desires, and fears, while we believe we are acting freely. Imagine, for instance, the quiet desperation that fills so many lives. The sense of rushing from task to task, accomplishment to accomplishment, with no lasting satisfaction. A treadmill of striving that feels endless. This is not mere busyness, but the symptom of a psyche cut off from meaning. For when the archetypes of depth are silenced, the void is filled by compulsions, addictions, and hollow rituals of consumption. Jung warned that when symbols lose their power, neuroses multiply, and what we see today is a civilization-wide neurosis, anxiety, epidemics, skyrocketing depression, compulsive distraction, and a culture that numbs itself with endless entertainment precisely to avoid confronting the emptiness it secretly feels. But the tragedy is that people rarely connect their suffering to the deeper wound, instead attributing it to circumstances, a bad job, a failed relationship, not enough money, without realizing that even when those circumstances change, the hunger remains, because the hunger is not for external success, but for inner integration, for contact with the self. And so entire lives can be spent chasing phantoms, mistaking substitutes for the real thing, accumulating wealth without security, pleasure without joy, relationships without intimacy, and information without wisdom. But the consequences do not stop with the individual, for when entire societies live from this wound, the collective begins to manifest symptoms as well. And Jung saw this clearly when he studied the rise of mass movements in the 20th century, understanding that the more individuals fail to individuate, to face their shadow, to integrate their unconscious, the more they are vulnerable to collective possession, to being overtaken by archetypal energies they do not recognize. Think of how whole populations can suddenly fall under the spell of ideologies, cults, or charismatic leaders, losing all sense of personal responsibility and projecting their own disowned shadows onto scapegoated groups. And you will see Jung's insight alive before you. Today this possession takes subtler forms, manifesting not only in politics but in consumer culture, where billions pour their energy into chasing status through brands, appearances, and curated identities, believing they are expressing individuality when in truth they are conforming to archetypes they do not consciously see. Every advertisement whispers to the unconscious, exploiting the archetype of the lover to sell beauty, the archetype of the hero to sell cars, the archetype of the trickster to sell technology. And in this bombardment, the individual becomes less a conscious chooser and more a vessel for archetypal currents manipulated by industries that know how to stir desires without fulfilling them. The consequence is a population that feels simultaneously overstimulated and empty, flooded with images yet starved for symbols, addicted to novelty yet terrified of silence, restless yet profoundly inert when it comes to true transformation. And if you look more deeply, you can see how this unconscious possession has infiltrated even the most intimate dimensions of life or relationships, where projection dominates, partners seeing not each other but their own unintegrated shadow or anima projected onto the other, leading to cycles of idealization and disappointment. Our work, where people dedicate decades to climbing hierarchies that collapse suddenly or reveal themselves to be meaningless. Our identities fractured into curated online personas that feel more real to others than to ourselves, leaving us strangers to our own essence. And beneath it all lies a terrifying possibility that the unconscious, when ignored, does not remain passive but grows restless, erupting in ways that are destructive when integration is refused. Jung observed this in his patients, whose repressed material often returned in the form of compulsions, phobias, or sudden eruptions of violence. And today we see it in societal form in outbreaks of nihilism, self-destruction, alienation, and even the collective despair that drives people toward escapism or extremism. Is it any wonder, then, that so many report feeling like they are living someone else's life, like they are wearing a mask they cannot remove, like they are floating untethered in a sea of images and demands with no anchor to the real? This sense of alienation is not a failure of the individual, but a symptom of an entire civilization estranged from its unconscious roots. And the price is mounting not only in mental health, but in the collapse of meaning structures themselves, leaving us vulnerable to the darkest forces within and without. Think of how Jung warned that the world will ask you who you are, and if you don't know, the world will tell you, and in that lies the essence of our predicament. For in not knowing ourselves, we have allowed the world its algorithms, its corporations, its ideologies to tell us who we are. And the identities we are given are hollow, unstable, and addictive, binding us in cycles of consumption and division. The unseen consequence of this is a growing inability to tolerate solitude, silence, or depth, for when you are cut off from your unconscious, these spaces feel unbearable, echoing with the cries of the exiled soul. And so people rush to fill every empty moment with stimulation, unaware that it is precisely in the silence, the dream, the inward turn, that the psyche reveals itself and offers healing. The deeper tragedy is that this avoidance not only harms individuals, but leaves humanity unprepared for the crises it now faces. For without inner orientation, we cannot face the outer chaos of climate collapse, technological upheaval, and social fragmentation with clarity. Instead, reacting from fear, projection, and unconscious compulsion. Jung foresaw this danger, writing that the greatest threat to humanity was not external catastrophe, but the inability of individuals to confront their own unconscious. For without this confrontation, we remain children playing with forces we do not understand, inventing machines that outpace our wisdom, unleashing powers we cannot control, and fragmenting into tribes that mirror back our unacknowledged shadows. Perhaps the most haunting consequence of all is the quiet despair that spreads through the background of ordinary life. The sense that despite all our progress, something essential has been lost. That beneath the glittering surface of civilization lies an emptiness too frightening to confront. And so we distract ourselves until death arrives and the opportunity is gone. But if you dare to feel this despair, you will see that it points to something crucial, that the unconscious will not be denied forever, that it calls to us through our dreams, our symptoms, our longings, our very dissatisfaction, demanding to be heard, and until we answer, the consequences will grow more dire, for a civilization that refuses its soul is a civilization doomed to repeat its traumas in ever more destructive forms. And so the unseen consequence of our disorientation is not only suffering in the present, but the looming shadow of a future in which humanity, more technologically advanced than ever, becomes spiritually bankrupt, a hollow giant stumbling through history with immense power and no wisdom, until it either awakens to its depths or destroys